Hi, it's Brian Winter. April is a great month to check out America's Society's music program. On April 10th, the extraordinary New York-based Jack Quartet will present music by composers from Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Mexico. And then on April 21st, you'll be able to listen to works by Brazilian composer Marcos Balter, played by the New York New Music Ensemble. America's Society is the House of Latin America in New York, and it's also the parent organization of AQ. To register for these and other events, go to musicoftheamericas.org. That's musicoftheamericas.org. This is the Americas Quarterly Podcast. I'm Brian Winter. Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum has been earning global attention for her high popularity, her calm negotiation style with President Trump, and for tougher policies on security than her predecessor. On today's podcast, we'll look at where President Sheinbaum has had success and potential challenges ahead.
A lot of people, Brian, thinks that this is happening because Trump is requiring Mexico to do this. However, these changes in security policies start happening before Trump took office. These start happening when Sheinbaum took office. So this is clearly a strategy that has her signature.
Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum is amazingly, almost inconceivably popular. More than 80% of Mexicans currently approve of her government. And I'll be honest, this was not something that many of us expected to happen. After all, President Sheinbaum was supposedly less charismatic than her also popular predecessor, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, a technocrat who some thought would struggle to reestablish his connection with Mexico's working class. Sheinbaum also took office facing an existential challenge, with Donald Trump threatening 25% tariffs unless Mexico took tougher action against flows of migration and drugs, especially fentanyl. Today, President Sheinbaum is still under tremendous pressure. President Trump has twice delayed the implementation of tariffs, but they're still very much on the table. And the demands he's making of Mexico keep shifting, making some wonder whether he is determined to put them in place, almost regardless of what Mexico does. The effect on Mexico would be devastating at a moment when the economy is already facing a potential recession this year. Mexico also faces tremendous challenges in security and concerns over the quality of its democracy following a recent reform that will replace the entire judiciary. And, let's face it, popularity can be ephemeral. People forget that Dilma Rousseff, who like Sheinbaum succeeded a very charismatic president in Brazil 15 years ago, was also one of the world's most popular leaders for a while, until things eventually fell apart. In this episode, we want to take a close look at President Sheinbaum so far, examine whether her popularity can last, her strategy for dealing with President Trump, how her government is different from that of her predecessor, how she is handling the economy, and the relationship with the private sector. Our guest is Viri Ríos, a writer, political scientist, and an analyst of Mexican politics and public policy. She's a friend of America's Quarterly, a close observer of Morena, President Sheinbaum's party, and its overall political project. Viri, welcome back to the AQ podcast.
Hi, Brian. It's great to be here again. Thank you so much. I'm a fan of this podcast, so thank you so much for the invitation.
You're very kind. So, Viri, we'll get into the relationship with Donald Trump, but let's look first at Mexico. As I noted in the introduction, President Sheinbaum is amazingly popular. Why?
Let me take what you're saying and give you a little bit of the numbers. So Sheinbaum has 80% approval rate. And this is above AMLO, the former president of Mexico, who by the time he had 74% approval rate. This makes Sheinbaum the second most popular head of state in the world, only above Modi from India. I would say that the main reasons why this is happening are three. First is social programs. A third of Mexicans view social programs, particularly poverty relief efforts conducted by Morena, as the most important action taken by the federal government. Many people believe that Morena has dramatically increased social spending, and that's why they are popular. However, that's really not true. Like since Morena took power, social expenditure has increased by 27%, which is, an important figure, but it's not huge considering that they had been in power for almost 7 years now. So what has changed is how social expenditure is distributed. There is a preference now for providing cash transfers instead of for providing in-kind programs. And that's precisely what people in Mexico are loving.
The minimum wage has also gone up a lot since AMLO first took office, and I assume she gets some credit for that too.
Absolutely. So a second reason, I would say, is the way that she has managed the relationship with President Trump. There is the perception that President Sheinbaum is managing the negotiations with Trump quite effectively, and that she is demonstrating a mix of professionalism, but also calmness, and that she has a quite significant amount of emotional intelligence. So there is a kind of like a sense that Sheinbaum is striking a very careful balance between avoiding to have direct confrontation with President Trump, something like Gustavo Petro did, and also steering clear from just like being completely subservient to the US. And another example of this would be, Sheinbaum, for example, not being like Justin Trudeau, who sought a very close relationship with Trump, only to end up humiliating during his visit to Mar-a-Lago and so on. We know the story. Finally, Brian, I would say that there is a third point, that is security policies. When Sheinbaum took office, only 28% of Mexicans thought that the security strategy of the Mexican government was correct. It was going in the right direction, only 28%. And now, just after 6 months of President Sheinbaum, that percentage has increased to 52%. That's a very significant change. We haven't observed a majority of Mexicans liking the security strategy, I would say probably in 15 years. So this is also something that is giving her a lot of credit.
And that's because she's been tougher on security. She's been deploying more police. She's been deploying the National Guard.
She has been much more confrontational against criminal organizations. She is capturing corrupt politicians at the local level, particularly. She has increased very significant the amount of arrests and also drug seizures. She's moving forward into the further militarization of the police forces, which is something that people generally like in Mexico. And also she's using much more a legal figure that exists in Mexico for prison without sentence, which allows her to basically arrest potential criminals without actually having to go through the very difficult process of judiciarizing, of actually, having a sentence for these criminals. A lot of people, Brian, thinks that this is happening because Trump is requiring Mexico to do this. However, these changes in security policies start happening before Trump took office. These start happening when Sheinbaum took office. So this is clearly a strategy that has her signature.
So, Viri, I want to come back to each of these three things, but let's linger on this subject of her popularity for a moment. This level of popularity is rarely sustainable. What is her biggest vulnerability in your view? If we do another episode 6 months from now and we're talking about Claudia Sheinbaum having come back to earth, what would have happened?
I think the answer is Trump, right? And particularly the economy and how the Mexican economy can get affected in the case that tariffs are actually implemented. More and more, I've been thinking that maybe for Trump, the tariffs are a goal in itself. And this is not necessarily about, punishing countries that are not delivering or countries that are disobedient. This is actually a policy that Trump wants to implement because he truly believes and his team truly believes that this policy can bring jobs and companies back to the US. And also because he believes that this policy may increase revenues for the US. So I think that probably Mexico is going to have to deal with this possibility, deal with the possibility of having to collaborate with the US, even if tariffs are implemented. If that is the case, then Mexico probably is going to need to negotiate a way to keep collaborating with the US by providing inputs of production, but not necessarily with the same openness as we observed since the 1990s. There is also a probability that Mexican products are going to be taxed and therefore when they cross the border, and therefore Mexican companies may have to diminish their profits.
Yeah, I believe, as you noted, that Donald Trump wants to implement tariffs for the reasons you cited, but that he has always seemed specifically interested in tariffs against Mexico. And it's worth saying Mexico at this point is hardly alone. I mean, he's talking about it as part of a global initiative. But, there is a belief in parts of the Trump administration, and certainly in the MAGA movement, that the decline of the U.S. manufacturing base in the United States really was accentuated by creating NAFTA in the early 1990s, and that Mexico in particular has, in their view, stolen jobs from the United States. Let me ask you, I mean, if that assumption is true and we are headed for tariffs of some kind against Mexico, things could get really bad for the Mexican economy. I mean, I've heard the view that, maybe 10% tariffs would not actually be the end of the world because the peso, the exchange rate, could essentially absorb that over time. But a 25% tariff, like the kind that Trump talked about during the campaign and has talked about more recently, would be catastrophic. What, in your sense, would be the impact on Mexican popular opinion and on the Sheinbaum administration if a scenario like that actually came to fruition?
I am positive about this scenario, and let me explain you why. For the sake of this argument, let's assume that Trump wants to implement tariffs independently of what Mexico does, independently of whether they manage to control immigration, security, and so on. And let's also assume that the reason why Trump wants to do this is two things. One is he wants to bring jobs back to the US. Second one is he wants to collect more taxes, right? The good news in that scenario is that Mexico is key to achieve both objectives. And let me explain why. To achieve the first goal, that is to bring jobs and companies back to the US, American companies would need to be extremely efficient because they would have to pay higher wages in the US, right? So the best way to achieve that level of efficiency would be to collaborate with Mexico because US companies would need a very reliable supplier that can afford inputs in affordable prices, right? So that's good for Mexico. That keeps Mexico alive, and that also keeps Mexico working hand in hand with the US economy, which is what Mexico has done since the 1990s. Second, let's assume that the goal is to collect taxes with tariffs, right? So increase revenue. If Trump really wants to do that, then profoundly damaging the Mexican economy is kind of like the worst possible outcome. Because ideally, you would implement tariffs, but in a, let's say, more calibrated way, such that the Mexican economy can continue exporting to the US at a large scale. Because only if Mexico does that, then you're going to collect taxes. Otherwise, nobody's going to export to the US, and then no tax collection is going to happen. So given these two possibilities, I think, I am positive. I think we are probably heading into a different world from the open, like pro-globalization world that we have lived since the 1990s. But in this new world with its own challenges, Mexico is going to survive, and the Mexican economy is going to keep doing well.
Your case makes total sense. Listeners to the podcast can't see me, but my neck hurts from nodding so vigorously while listening to you talk. But it's not clear to me that President Trump sees it that way. and that people in his administration like Stephen Miller see it that way. What's your sense sitting there in Mexico City and trying to read the tea leaves like the rest of us as to whether this administration, this White House, will appreciate the argument that you just articulated?
Look, I agree that we may not be facing necessarily rational administration. But I think that rationality is going to come back and it's going to just like exert itself because the reality is there, and the reality is that both economies, both the US and Mexico, depend on each other. And I think the markets have a very similar read to the one I am providing, because if you observe how the Mexican peso has done over the last month and so on, the Mexican peso is pretty strong. And the reason why the currency is strong is precisely because everybody knows that independently of the, I would say, narrative irrationality that exists in the Trump coalition, the reality is that Trump needs Mexico to deliver. It needs Mexico to deliver in terms of security, in terms of immigration, but it also needs Mexico to deliver in terms of inflation control. And Mexico is the only country politically aligned with the US that can provide those three things. Let me just add one thing, which is that I feel that Mexico knows its resilience. And even if Mexicans perceive, of course, that this is a very difficult moment, that the rhetoric is against Mexico, that Trump wants to damage the Mexican economy and so on, I think that deep inside Mexican entrepreneurs and deep inside Mexican business, they feel that Mexico is in a good position. They feel that Mexico has good leadership with President Sheinbaum, and they also know that America depends on Mexico. So that's why I think the markets are reacting in this way.
I think the White House is rational. I just think they're more protectionist, perhaps, than the market appreciates. Let me ask you about, I have to ask you a question just about Claudia Sheinbaum herself. It seems like she too has evolved, because after she was first elected, there were one or two times where she seemed tempted to match the rhetoric that Donald Trump was using. I remember there was one incident when President Trump seemed to mention a Mexican government official, Marcelo Ebrard, at which point President Sheinbaum came out with this, very sort of florid defense of Marcelo Ebrard. There were a couple other occasions where she said that there would essentially be a tit for tat response in terms of tariffs. What do you know about this process of evolution that brought her to this serene but firm stance that she seems to have adopted today?
Initially, maybe Mexico thought that the threat of tariffs was not necessarily solid, but increasingly, it became very evident for Mexican negotiators that Trump is serious about what he's saying, that he actually believes in protectionism, and that Mexico has to have a negotiation strategy that speaks to that protectionism. Meaning, Mexico is not going to convince Trump of, thinking on the relationship in a different way. That's just not going to happen, right? So what needs to happen is that Mexico accommodates its rhetoric to provide Trump with gains, right? So these gains can be in terms of migration and in terms of security, which, by the way, Mexico is delivering very strongly on both topics. Or these gains can be also in the form of having a different public approach to what is happening. I honestly feel there was a lot of learning also from the accident, I would say, that happened with Colombia, with Petro, because Petro was the first president to actually confront directly Donald Trump in social media, right? And I think the reaction was so viral and so strong to try to punish Colombia that the rest of Latin America learned that was not probably the way to do it.
How do you understand President Sheinbaum ideologically? Is she more of a leftist than AMLO?
In some ways she is, but she's also, I would say, smarter. There are very important differences, I would say, between both of them. One is that Sheinbaum is a left thinker, so she believes in reducing inequality, increasing wages. She believes on increasing social programs and so on. But she also believes that in order to achieve that, she has to be business friendly. So it cannot be just like confrontational against business and against people that owns capital and that takes decisions on the markets, because that's just like self-defeating. Second thing is, I think that even if she is left wing, she's not willing to stop using the force, right? Like when we think about her security policy that has been very confrontational, this is not something that you would necessarily expect from like a traditional left wing government that would be more focused on prevention, on like attending the causes of crime and so on. But she is mano dura, like we say in Latin America. She is willing to use the force, to use the military, and to crush criminal organizations. And she's trying to do that.
And AMLO was always hesitant to do so.
Yes, because AMLO is more of a traditional left. And I think that AMLO misread what happened in Mexico, which is that in Mexico during the 2000s, during the early 2000s, when the federal government decided to confront criminal organizations, violence increased because criminal groups fracture in like different cells that battle each other. So then he thought that if he confronted drug cartels, the outcome was going to be more violent. So he designed a strategy to not confront. That strategy was, in my opinion, mistaken because first, violence may have diminished, but crime started operating and increasing in other ways, right? Controlling some areas of their territory, diversifying their portfolio to do more criminal activities within Mexico, and so on.
Let's talk a little bit more about her security policy. She appointed her security chief from her time as mayor of Mexico City, Omar Garcia Harfuch, in an important security role now as president, hoping that he can, have some of the same achievements that they had when they were running the city, a period during which homicides fell by half. You noted that there's been some progress, certainly in terms of, fentanyl seizures and other things that are being pushed by the Trump administration. You also said that she was already doing this before President Trump took office. But in practice, Viri, has President Trump provided political cover for President Sheinbaum to do things that she wanted to do, but might otherwise not have because of her relationship with AMLO?
That's a very interesting question. I would say no, because the change in security strategy start happening right when Sheinbaum takes office. Trump, however, facilitates that this strategy increases and is implemented faster and so on. But this is a strategy that she had definitely thought from before. As you said, she appointed Mexico City's Minister of Security, Omar Garcia Harfuch, as the federal Minister of Security. She is much more involved in the relationship, both with him, but also in terms of security. She has a daily meeting early in the morning where she actually makes decisions, makes questions. I would say she is like much more of a manager in terms of determining what the security policy is going to be. Let me just focus on two things that I think she's doing differently, because this is not, I would say, a strategy that we have observed in Mexico before. So this is not what we saw during the Calderon period or during Peña Nieto period, where they were confrontational against criminal organizations. But back then, the idea was just to arrest the kingpin, arrest the head of a drug cartel, and then expect that was going to reduce violence. And that's not what happened. So she's doing two things that are different. The first thing is that she's focused on following the money. So she is trying to not only capture drug cartels, but capture those leaders that are on charge of specific areas of criminal organizations that are very profitable, right? So fentanyl is one example, but it's not the only example. Another important example is oil theft. So she's focusing on that. And the idea is that more than looking for any kingpin, what you should be doing is looking for those areas that are providing resources to criminal organizations. And the second thing that she's doing differently is that she is confronting politicians that have relationship with criminal organizations. We have observed for the first time, I would say in a long time, Mexican authorities actually going after mayors of cities where there has been some evidence that they are conducting criminal organizations or helping criminal organizations. So it feels that there is a kind of like an acceptance that there is a collusion sometimes between local authorities and criminal organizations, and that ending this problem of violence in Mexico requires to ending that collusion first.
I want to talk just for a moment, Viri, about the discovery of this mass grave in Teochitlan in Jalisco state. This was a discovery that seems to have really horrified vast parts of Mexican society. Just a few days ago, as we record this, on the site, authorities found ashes, bones, hundreds of clothing items, along with furnaces that may have been used to incinerate bodies. The context for this is, according to government data, Mexico has more than 120,000 missing persons, mainly due to cartel-related violence. The real number may be much higher. How is the country reacting to this and to the government's initial, declarations after this discovery was made?
The problem of missing persons, desaparecidos, disappearances, as Mexicans call them, is a very serious problem in Mexico. So there are some figures that show that around 100,000 people are missing. And probably the reason is that people was assassinated, but their bodies were somehow disappeared by criminal organizations. Criminal organizations have an incentive to do this because if they kill somebody and the body doesn't show up, then it doesn't show on the official statistics. And then strangely, this is a win-win both for the Mexican government and criminal groups, because the Mexican government can claim that there is not a problem because bodies are not appearing. And criminal groups are okay about it because they can keep being violent without enforcement coming after them. What we are observing is a radical, I would say, difference in how former President AMLO used to deal with this topic versus how Sheinbaum is trying to deal with this topic. So AMLO used to focus, whenever the problem of missing persons came out, he used to focus on how the discussion was, according to him, mostly an attempt of the opposition to weaken his government. Sheinbaum has said also that the opposition is taking advantage of the topic, but is marginal to her speech. I think the most important thing that she has done is to actually focus on delivering a list of policies that her government will conduct to mitigate the problem. I don't know if Sheinbaum is going to be successful at this, but just for Mexicans, just observing this difference is very soothing. And it's also a source of like increasing her popularity, because she is actually dealing with this in a much more professional way.
Viri, changing gears a bit, when I speak to leaders in the private sector in Mexico and in the United States, I think there's a strong appreciation, as you've noted, for the way that she has been able to negotiate and deal with President Trump so far. I think there is also an appreciation for her tougher stance on security issues. But I still hear people very worried about the judicial reform that happened after President Sheinbaum was elected, which essentially paves the way for the entire judiciary to be replaced with elected judges. And, there are concerns about the institutional climate, the quality of democracy in Mexico more broadly. How are you seeing things on that front, and how much of a concern is this for her?
There are many aspects of the judicial reform that I dislike. I don't believe it will meaningfully improve the justice system. I think it will create uncertainty during the transition, and I am concerned that the learning curve for the new judges could temporarily affect the quality of justice in Mexico. A more effective reform would have focused on changing the Supreme Court and reducing corruption within the judiciary, and that's it. That said, I also recognize that many policies aim at increasing democratic participation were initially very criticized. And the arguments used to criticize those policies sound kind of like very similar to the ones that are being used to criticize the Mexican judicial reform. Arguing, for example, that people do not know how to vote, that politics is bad, that technical decisions are apolitical and therefore better, and so forth. Greater public involvement in decision-making has never been as harmful as originally anticipated. There is also one more thing, which is that the judicial system was never truly defined in Mexico by only its technical expertise. The judicial system in Mexico was a political space where laws were interpreted through a political lens and where certain groups maintained control. Given that reality, it is not entirely accurate to say that a technical authority is being replaced by a political authority. What is happening is more than a covertly political system is being replaced by an openly political system. Now, whether one or the other is better, that's open to debate. I personally don't know, but I don't believe that the new justice system in Mexico will be necessarily worse than the current system. I think it will actually look very similar. I also want to give Mexico a chance because Mexico has surprised us before with quite interesting institutional designs. And I prefer to wait and analyze the outcomes based on concrete evidence.
And the institutional climate writ large, The Economist once again has Mexico classified as a hybrid regime rather than a democracy.
I disagree with the classification of The Economist. There are many things that don't work in Mexico, including in its democracy. But the roots and the main ingredients of democracy, which is people having the capacity of both freedom of expression, freedom of association, and so on, remain strong in Mexico. You could even say that they are stronger than ever because people feel that democracy is working. There is an increase in participation. There is an increase in the trust in political parties and so on. Mexico is, of course, an imperfect democracy, but so is the U.S. and so are many other countries. I think The Economist is missing it.
Final question for you, Viri, and none of us have crystal balls, but all of us who are analysts are asked to do this exercise from time to time. When you think about where Mexico is likely to be 3 years from now, politically and economically, there is so much uncertainty right now. But when you think about the future, what do you see?
And I don't like to say the future because I'm not very good at that. But let me tell you what has happened. Over the last 20 years, Mexico has grown on average at 2%, which is much less than the country needs. There is a problem of growth that is probably going to be accentuated due to the uncertainty created by Trump. So maybe we're going to observe less than 2% in the future. And actually, the new estimates are that the Mexican economy is going to have problems of growth, at least in the next 2 or 3 years. So maybe we're going to observe that. I think the fundamentals of Mexico are right in the sense that it is an export-oriented economy. It has macroeconomic stability. It doesn't have problems of inflation like in Argentina. It doesn't have a problem of massive taxation like in Brazil. I think overall the fundamentals of Mexico are right. And I hope that Mexico can figure out policies that take those fundamentals to the next level, which is not only being a good place on paper, but also being a good economy that actually grows. But, honestly, I don't know if Mexico is going to manage to do that in the short term. I hope it does. And I think it has the potential to do it. But right now, the country is in a difficult moment for sure.
And it's interesting, listening to your answer, you're talking more about internal factors than external ones.
Right. And I think internally, I think Mexico is solid. The problem is, in this occasion, the problem is the international environment and particularly the changes in the U.S. global policies.
Well, on that note, Viri, thank you so much for joining us on the AQ Podcast.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly Podcast is produced and edited by Luisa Franco. Our sound engineer is Gabriela Baez.